Welcome back, everyone who was present in the previous session, and welcome for the first time, everyone of you who is tuning in for the first time now. Welcome to this winter seminar on progress in theology, live from Amsterdam. The first paper in our conference will be given by Gijsbert van der Brink, Professor Gijsbert van der Brink. He is a prolific theologian in the Netherlands. He has written extensively on a variety of topics. He wrote a somewhat older book already on divine omnipotence, God's omnipotence. He wrote a book on the canons of Dort. It was a Dutch book. But his main interest and his main research interest lies in the relation between theology and science. He has a special chair for theology and science at the Vrije University of Amsterdam, a so-called University Research Chair. He wrote a book of philosophy of science for theologians. He wrote a dogmatics book with his colleague Kees van der Kooi. But most well known, I think, is his work in the area of science and theology. His book, Reformed Theology and Evolutionary Theory, which appeared with the publisher Eerdmans in 2018, I believe, or perhaps 2019, which is a wonderful book, a daring book, and it has gained a lot of attention, and rightly so. In our project, Gijsbert leads the sub-project on progress in theology, and I'm very happy to be able to give the floor to him as he's going to speak to us on the topic of epistemic progress in theology, a survey of the options. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, René, for your kind introduction, and thank you all for tuning in. I'm so sorry that we can't have you here at this wonderful place in Amsterdam, where we are with some 12 people right now. Due to the Dutch restrictions, we thought it might be impossible to have you, but it turned out, after all, that as of yesterday, we would have been allowed to host 1,250 people. So you who have tuned in now may have been most welcome to be here in Amsterdam with us these days. I'm so sorry, and it's frustrating that couldn't materialize. But nevertheless, I hope the people here are doing a really great job in hosting this hybrid conference. So both the people here in the room and you who have tuned in from elsewhere should be able to not only listen to the lectures but also participate in the Q&As. In the opening scene of Thornton Wilder's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel *The Bridge of St. Louis Ray*, a book from 1927, a Franciscan monk, Brother Juniper, reveals that he wants to give theology a place among the exact sciences. And he had been looking in vain for a way to do so for quite some time, when all of a sudden an opportunity was thrown into his lap, to say so. On a warm day in July 1714, he witnesses, by sheer coincidence, how the suspension bridge of San Luis Rey near Lima, Peru, collapses, and how the 5 people on the bridge make a deadly fall into the ravine below. Since apparently the bridge was not sabotaged and no one could have predicted its collapse, not even through a probability calculation, Brother Juniper concludes that this accident must have been an act of God. So that it offered what is said in the book, a perfect laboratory to test the theological doctrine of divine providence. If that doctrine is correct, it must be possible to find out why God allowed precisely these 5 persons to perish in the collapse of the bridge. We would make wonderful progress in theology, Brother Juniper suggests, if he could track down God's reasons for allowing this particular 5 people to die in this accident. And so Brother Juniper embarks on an interesting research project by investigating the biographies of these 5 people, inquiring into possible hidden justifications of their sudden death. And as you can imagine, each chapter of the book then describes the biography of one of these 5 persons. The results of the project, unfortunately, are inconclusive, but as you can also imagine, they give a lot to think about. I won't spill the beans by telling you how the story ends. It seems to me that Thornton Wilder's novel offers a stark illustration of the rationale behind the topic of our seminar and of the ambiguities that surround it. Whereas in science, no theory can survive without evidence in its favor being brought to bear on it, theological theories like the doctrine of divine providence, so the idea that God guides or steers or oversees everything that happens in the world, including our own lives, it seems that such theories are impervious to empirical corroboration or falsification. They stay unaltered over the course of time, and you can either embrace or reject the doctrine depending on your personal preferences. More generally, it may seem that no progress is possible at all in finding out the truth about theological statements, and that therefore theology's place among the sciences, or what we might call among the properly academic disciplines, can be contested, to say the least. And of course, many people do contest the legitimacy of theology in that sense, and for this reason. Let me give you two very vocal affirmations of this point of view. First, there is Jerry Coyne. So this is the challenge. Jerry Coyne says, theology, I quote, is like postmodern literary criticism. It's a game that never progresses to any real understanding. It bounces around from fad to fad, blown by the winds of secular thought, but has no way within itself to arrive at a real understanding of the universe, end of quote. Coyne especially then points to the enormous amount of religious diversity, which in his view demonstrates the incapacity of theology to make any progress. There is no unanimity among religious believers about any theological issue whatsoever. For example, how many gods there are, what God is like, what God's commands are, whether there is hell or an afterlife of any sort, how you get saved, whether you're reincarnated, and so on, end of quote. So it's this lack of consensus which, in his view, amounts to a lack of increase in knowledge or understanding, a lack of progress in theology. Interestingly, Jerry Coyne compares theology to the discipline of literary criticism in this regard, or at least to its postmodern variety. So he is aware that there are more disciplines around in academia than just theology on the one hand and the sciences on the other. Richard Dawkins, by contrast, compares theology only to the natural sciences, neglecting all academic disciplines that lie somewhere in between. I think you might think that a good case can be made for theology as being more like the humanities, for example, in that it's largely interpretative in character, so that it shouldn't be compared to the sciences, to the natural sciences, but to some of the humanities, history, for example, or philosophy. But Dawkins just compares natural sciences and theology. And then he argues that it is science and science alone that has given us knowledge. Theology, on the other hand, has never said, and now I quote again, anything of the smallest use, anything that was not either platitudinously obvious or downright false. The achievements of theologians don't do anything, don't affect anything, don't even mean anything. What makes you think that theology is a subject at all? End of quote. Now, even if we take into account that this is a willful exaggeration for rhetorical purposes, and also that perhaps Dawkins has had his day these times precisely because of the exaggeration which is evident in such claims. In a lower key, the very same sentiment is clearly pervasive in contemporary Western societies. Theology is a suspicious activity, perhaps even a pseudoscience, some might think, since in contrast to the natural sciences, it does not make any progress. It doesn't contribute to the establishment of what might rightly be called knowledge or understanding. In this paper, or in this lecture, I won't mount a full-scale rebuttal of this charge. Rather, my aim is more modest and also of a more of a preliminary nature. I would like to chart or map the various responses that might be given to the charge that theology doesn't display any progress. In what ways might theologians or friends of theology respond to it? How many options do they have? In particular, I will set out to show that there are at least 5 possible avenues of response. And I will spend my time, some 35 minutes from now on, I believe, by briefly exploring and comparing each of these 5 options, possible responses. In doing so, I will work with a pretty much colloquial notion of theology. Let us say one that is sympathetic to Thomas Aquinas' definition of theology as the study of God and everything in the light of God. Or if you prefer more abstract terms, the study of everything in the light of the transcendent. I've gleaned from the program of this seminar that some later speakers during the seminar will problematize and diversify the concept of theology a bit more than I do, and I'm looking forward to that, how that works out. But I myself, I want to stay close to what theology is supposed to be also in the eyes of ordinary people. So let's say systematic talk about God. And that's not to prioritize systematic theology as if that were the only branch of theology or the only serious subdiscipline. Also, other branches of theology, such as practical theology or empirical theology or biblical theology or historical theology, could be fully seen as theological in the full sense, as long as they continue to be talking about God. And when they start to talk about human beliefs about God, the scene becomes different, I believe. I would call that anthropology rather than theology. The stakes are much higher when of course, academics suggest that they can talk about God in a systematic way. So that's about the notion of theology. As to the notion of progress, I regret the fact that the English seems to have only one word for what in the Dutch language are 2 slightly different concepts, namely vooruitgang on the one hand and voortgang on the other hand. I think these words are on the slides, yeah. Voortgang is sometimes translated as advancement, but even that may be too strong. It just means something like continuation with change involved in the continuation. So I suggest that voortgang is a descriptive concept. Just like one can observe that people continue in performing certain activities, for example in making music, one can also observe that the discipline continues or evolves or develops or changes over time. No judgment on the quality of the change or development is involved there. It's just an observation. Progress in the sense of vooruitgang, on the other hand, is a normative concept, as has been already very helpfully pointed out by René van Woudenberg before the break. So a judgment or evaluation or assessment is involved in the concept of progress as vooruitgang, namely the judgment that the change over time is one for the good. It is one from a less desirable to a more desirable state of affairs, or from a worse to a better state. It's important, I think, to disambiguate these 2 concepts, for otherwise we might be inclined to claim a too easy victory. When we recall Jerry Coyne's objection to theology, for example, it's not that theology is inert, remaining the same over time. In fact, Coyne concedes that theology is continuously developing and changing. But in his view, that change doesn't come to much more than bouncing around from fad to fad. It's not progress to any real understanding. So in Dutch, in his view, there's a lot of voortgang, but there is no vooruitgang. But is that so? Doesn't theology make any progress in the sense of vooruitgang? Let's explore 5 possible answers. Here's the first one. No, theology does not make any progress indeed, and rightly so. Surprisingly, perhaps, theologians and their friends might concede that Coyne, Dawkins, and the likes are right. Theology doesn't display much progress indeed, in order to then suggest that perhaps this is an intellectual virtue rather than a vice. This may seem a weird rejoinder, but I believe it can actually be unpacked in interesting ways. Perhaps we should not strive for more progress in theology, but for more theology in progress. That is, for more critical reflection from a transcending perspective on our common addiction to the very idea and ideal of progress. It can hardly be denied that precisely the ideal of progress contributes enormously to most of, if not all of today's major global problems. The self-imposed requirement of economic growth, for example, is on the one hand fueled by the continuous progress of science and technology, and is on the other hand, as we now know with greater certainty than ever before, a disastrous impact on the Earth's biosphere, seriously endangering our planet's future. Perhaps in such a situation, it's theology's task not so much to mimic the ideal of progress in its own field by striving after progress itself, but to tap into its resources in order to initiate and stimulate a critical debate on the extent to which the notion of progress has become an idol indeed. Given the almost universal spell of this deeply ambiguous notion of progress, and the way in which it guides and determines our collective behaviors, it may indeed require a transcendent, if you will, a prophetic perspective from beyond the sphere of worldly affairs to unmask what is actually going on here. And perhaps it's theology's primary task to voice, articulate, and flesh out such a perspective, hoping to find many allies along the way. I myself have embarked on a project indeed on theology and climate change, just to address this particular issue. So perhaps it's not self-evident for us humans to invest in making constant scientific, technological, and economic progress in an attempt to conquer the world and even the universe. It may rather be our calling, as American farmer and cultural critic Wendell Berry puts it, it may rather be our calling to live in peace with our neighbors and then to die. Not to travel that much, just to live in peace with your neighbors and then to die. Now, someone might object, however, that I am surreptitiously changing the topic by smuggling in a wider notion of progress than we started out with. As a matter of fact, it was epistemic progress we were talking about, right? So the Coyne-Dawkins complaint is that theology does not contribute to the production of epistemic values like knowledge and understanding, perhaps wisdom, perhaps believing less falsehoods, perhaps believing more justified true beliefs, etc. So surely epistemic progress is different from economic growth. But even if you would agree that these two are totally unconnected and that the ideal of constant economic growth is not driven by epistemic progress in the sciences, which is a hard claim to make, I believe, even if that's true, the theologian might still turn to the no progress accusation from a vice into a virtue. For if theology doesn't make ongoing epistemic progress indeed, doesn't this make its standards all the more reliable? René was also referring to this monk in the novel of Umberto Eco, who suggested something like that. If in theology we can still agree about many things with Augustine, for example, and we can learn from Thomas Aquinas or John Calvin, doesn't that testify to a certain robustness of the theological discipline and its tenets? And presumably, we might say similar things about theology's big sister, philosophy. By contrast, if you examine the sciences, it seems that the often rapid pace of their epistemic progression may hamper their reliability. Of course, there is a mode of epistemic progress that consists in coming to know new things without having to give up previous scientific views on the same issue. Here we might speak of pure extension of the orbit of our knowledge and understanding. But if it's true, as some have argued in the wake of Larry Laudan's theory of pessimistic meta-induction, if it's true that as a result of science progress, many outcomes of past science are now deemed false, we can hardly trust the outcomes of today's science, since these may easily be invalidated by future developments in the sciences. So, whereas contemporary scientists can only smile at, for example, Aristotle's physics, what about future physicists and scientists, let's say 200 years from now, looking back to the state of current physics? Perhaps they will smile as well. So it could therefore be argued that the longevity of its conclusions strengthens theology's trustworthiness rather than diminishing it. Perhaps I would suggest the optimum for an academic discipline is to make some epistemic progress over time, but not too much, because that would mean to discard the credentials of its own past. So could we say that theology does make at least some epistemic progress? And here's a second answer. I would say yes. For example, it does make some progress in the wake of the sciences. And this seems incontrovertible to me. To give an obvious example, over the past couple of centuries, the geological and biological sciences have shown that the universe is much older than the 6 to 10,000 years, which were traditionally assumed on the basis of biblical genealogy. And this newly acquired insight has helped theology to discard certain traditional interpretations of the book of Genesis, right? To be sure, in a sense, this did not lead to positive knowledge, so that we now know how to interpret Genesis after all. But clearly, epistemic progress is not just made by acquiring new knowledge or ways of understanding, but also by overcoming false beliefs. After all, getting to know that something is not the case is acquiring new knowledge as well. Similarly, many other scientific discoveries have led to adjustments and, for all we know, improvements of theological views that used to be based on assumptions which have now become obsolete as a result of scientific developments. So in my own work, René referred to that already in his introduction. In my own work, I've proposed a couple of adjustments, which I hope are, of course, are improvements of theological views as a result of the attempt to do full justice to biological and cultural evolution. Of course, theologians should not go after each and every scientific development which occurs in time, but as soon as some conclusions of the sciences become consolidated knowledge, become established, then I think theologians should do well to take these into account. Now, one may object, though, that this type of progress in theology, progress it makes in the wake of the sciences, does not amount to real progress, because it's fully dependent on epistemic advances that are made outside of theology in the natural, or for that matter, the social sciences. One might even suggest that theology is just parasitic on the sciences in making this sort of progress. So I might turn this into criticism of theology. Yet, that would be to ignore the fact that theology is, or at least should be, inherently involved with what is going on in the sciences. Many introductions to systematic theology rightly tell their readers that theology consists in the attempt to triangulate the data of biblical scholarship, doctrinal development, and contemporary thinking, both within and outside the sciences. To do so in creative and compelling ways. So it belongs to the very nature of theology to take scientific developments seriously. Yeah, I think I should have this one. Yeah, so such adjustments are not concessions, but it belongs to the very nature of theology to interact with contemporary cultural, but also scientific developments. So perhaps we should rather say that theologians are just better equipped towards interdisciplinary working than many scientists, since theologians should have an open view to what's going on in the sciences, and one can only hope that scientists are as open to relate their views on the scientific endeavor, its nature, its tasks, its meaning, to theological assessments of the created order. Moreover, it might be argued that just as the sciences occasionally induce epistemic advancement in theology, the reverse is also true. Theological views may from time to time usher in novel, better, or more encompassing ways of understanding in the sciences. And this actually brings me to the third response to the question whether theology does display science of progress, of epistemic progress. So this answer is theology generates epistemic progress within the sciences. Indeed, theological views and convictions may prompt scientists to explore and test certain hypotheses or theories, which may subsequently find corroboration and even become generally accepted. An interesting example here is the way in which the Belgian priest and physicist Georges Lemaitre famously suggested in 1931 that the universe might have started with what he called a primeval atom, or atom. Is it atom or atom? Atom, yeah, primeval atom, which started to expand. An event which was later to be renamed as the Big Bang. Now, Lemaitre himself, to be sure, has always denied that this theory was inspired by his theological belief that the universe, as being created by God, had a beginning, rather than being static over time. Even though, interestingly, he suggested this theory for the first time at the conference on the relation between cosmology and spirituality. Yet, in any case, Lemaitre did not share the reservations with which some secular cosmologists like Fred Hoyle, but also Albert Einstein, responded to his idea. Reservations that were at least partly and openly so inspired by the theory's similarity to the biblical account of creation. So it seems safe to say that because of Lemaitre's theological background and background knowledge, he was much more open to explore this particular theory than some of his peers, a theory which, as you know, has now found almost general acceptance. The history of the relationships between science and religion shows more instantiations of the same pattern. Thus, it has often been argued, and it's still being argued, that certain theological assumptions, such as a strong belief in human fallibility as a result of the fall into sin, have been highly conducive to the rise of methods of empirical research on which modern science became based. Peter Harrison, for example, has done quite some work on this. In fact, the research project within which our seminar is embedded also contains a sub-project that focuses, as René has been pointing out before the break, also contains a sub-project that focuses on the supposed interaction between 16th century religious reformations on the one hand and the so-called scientific revolution on the other. And the idea here is that there may be a causal, maybe an interaction here. Indeed, there may even be a causal relationship in that the mentality which drove religious reformations may be the very same mentality that also was responsible for innovations which led to the emergence of modern science. And perhaps even more literally, theological beliefs were playing a role here as well, like the belief in the human fall into sin, which clouds our reason and which makes that we shouldn't trust our thinking, but we should really look into the state of the art, looking into the empirical reality to get to know how things really are. Of course, it would not be difficult to also mention historical situations in which theological convictions actually obstructed scientific progress. The Galileo case being the most famous example here. So this testifies to the fact that at times that the multifaceted connections between science and religion could all be subsumed under one overarching meta-narrative, either in terms of harmony, the suggestion that science and religion have always been in harmony, or that they have always been in conflict, or that they have always been separated. All such narratives, such meta-narratives, have rightly become questioned, I believe. History, in fact, shows a very variegated pattern of lively interactions between theology and science, or religion and science, and it seems certain that theology did on various occasions contribute to scientific progress. Even recently, to mention one more example, theologians are stimulating quantum physicists to explore specific interpretations of quantum mechanics in order to find out which ones are hospitable to what theologians like Robert John Russell have called the concept of non-interventionist divine action. Now, someone might counter that this might still be insufficient to buttress theology's epistemic credibility. Given processes of serendipity and given science's widely divergent contexts of discovery, it's not surprising that theology can lead to progress in the sciences. Also, alchemy, for example, or astrology can be demonstrated to have fulfilled such a role. They were not just instances of superstition. It was not so clear how to make the difference between chemistry and alchemy, for example, and it's only over time that the two parted ways, and chemistry became a proper academic discipline, unlike alchemy. So it might be countered that what is decisive is whether or not a discipline is making progress in and of itself. So this brings us to a fourth answer to the question whether theology generates epistemic progress, which is theology makes epistemic progress in and of itself. So in itself, not induced by the sciences, and also, or not in the sciences, and also of itself, that means not induced by the sciences. That would, it seems, be a real instance of epistemic progress, condoning the place of theology in the academy. Now, I think that it's quite clear that theology does play voortgang, so progress in the sense of development, even independently of the sciences. For example, within the mainstream Christian theological paradigm, many things have changed over time. This is embarrassing again.
Misschien de volgende slide ook.
Ja. So voortgang in theology can be observed in many ways, and I refer to a paper by Rick Pills now. I will do this very briefly because I just understood that he will be going into this in his own paper, which had to be rescheduled, which will be given later today rather than tomorrow. He told me that he had waited to see what I would make of it and then adapt this paper, but he doesn't have any time to do so. So I will go into this just very briefly. But I need to say something about it just to make sure that you can see that there is indeed progress in the sense of voortgang in theology in and of itself. So if we limit our attention to the past century or so, new directions of research have been developed, such as eco-theology or feminist theology. New research programs have been elaborated, such as Barthian dialectical theology, which started exactly 100 years ago, in 1922. Previous theories in theology have become largely discredited, and new theories gained traction in their place, even to the extent of acquiring near consensus. For example, and this example is not from Rick, but I come up with it of my own. So, whereas in the past, Christian theologians were convinced of the doctrine of divine impossibility, so the idea that God is unable to suffer, today, most theologians argue that God is actually possible, which means God is able to experience emotions, even emotions which imply suffering. And this is a real sea tide change, which is across the board of theology, has been taking place across the board of theology in a sense. So theologians have also come up with theories about how previous generations of theologians could have missed this point, since it seems so evident, for example, in the biblical scriptures. Another example is the view that Israel and Judaism not only have played, but also continue to play a pivotal role in the history of redemption. Also, this view has found wide acceptance over the past half century or so. Of course, there are still theologians who stick to the older views in these cases. But I think we might say that that is not decisive. There also continue to be biologists who, in spite of Dobzhansky's famous motto that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, still there are also biologists who continue to reject evolutionary theory. If complete peer consensus were a necessary condition for epistemic progress, then even the Big Bang cannot be considered as such. In fact, it would be hard to mention any examples of it at all, I'm afraid. So, there are a lot of developments within theology in and of itself. There are falsehoods that have been left behind. There are new tools that have been developed. There are new questions that are being addressed. For example, in the theology after Auschwitz, whether it's possible to believe in God in the face of genocide. And here, of course, the doctrine of divine omnipotence comes in again. And you might argue that this doctrine is being negotiated and revisited and elaborated on all the time in theology. Also, new distinctions are being made, new connections with other disciplines are being forged. For example, in my own field, theology and science, which is a fairly recent development, that this has emerged into a discipline or a subdiscipline of its own, with its own scientific or scholarly organizations, journals, societies, and so on and so forth. So it seems to me that all these are fully convincing examples of voortgang in theology, of continuation, of change, of development. But whether these are also instances of vooruitgang probably depends on whether or not one shares the basic assumptions of the Christian theological paradigm. Is this answer 5 already? Oh, wait a minute.
So, nog 10 minuten.
Yeah. So, if you don't share the basic assumptions of the paradigm in question, you will probably see them as mere examples of change, of development over time, and not of progress, perhaps even of bouncing around from fad to fad, as Jerry Coyne says. If one does share the basic assumptions of the paradigm in question, however, the voortgang can perhaps be seen as instances of what John Henry Newman called the development of doctrine. The idea here being that over time, more and more light is shed over the actual content of certain Christian doctrines due to closer attention, due to new developments, and all sorts of factors which John Henry Newman has described in his 1846 book. In any case, it requires a normative perspective to decide whether such changes indeed embody progress. As long as the changes remain intra-paradigmatic, as you might say, even the rise of full consensus would not amount to progress, would not count as proof of progress, since obviously even entire communities can err just as well as individuals. So this leads us almost naturally to the fifth possible answer to our question, which is by far the most audacious and therefore tentative one. And that is that theology even makes progress beyond the intra-paradigmatic level. Does theology indeed exhibit forms of progress that go beyond the boundaries of a particular theological tradition? That's the question. And let's call this trans-paradigmatic progress. In unpacking this answer, I will be following the suggestion of Ian Barber to consider the various main religions as each embodying a theological paradigm of their own. I mean, this can of course be debated. Hans Küng, the Roman Catholic theologian, argued that also various traditions or schools within the Christian tradition, or the Muslim or Buddhist tradition for that matter, could be considered as full-scale paradigms. But it seems to me that the former view, the Barber view, has clear advantages and is to be preferred. For example, the transition from Second Temple Judaism to early Christianity can be conceived as a major conceptual paradigm shift. My colleague Dick Martin Gruen has written about that. But it's not so clear that, for example, the Protestant Reformations of the 16th century embodied a similarly encompassing overhaul of existing basic assumptions. Usually Protestants and Catholics, even when they disagree about certain issues, can understand what they mean, right? And that's often a problem in the case of different paradigms. Now let me start with the observation that if theology does not show much trans-paradigmatic progression, this is hardly a shame. For according to post-Kuhnian philosophy of science, in the sciences as well, epistemic progress is mainly limited to the intra-paradigmatic level. So Thomas Kuhn himself has compared such what he calls usual progress in normal scientific practices with the progress that theologians are making in explaining a particular dogma. So Kuhn himself at least saw a parallel here. In both cases, the normative judgment that the developments should be considered as progress is made in light of the paradigm's core parameters. But the question is science also making progress when in the course of time, when one paradigm is substituted by another? And Kuhn found it extremely difficult to answer that question, as you may remember. Of course, from the perspective of the adherents of the new paradigm, progress has been realized, and it's tempting to take that perspective for granted, like we are always tempted to take the perspective of the winners of a historical battle for granted, rather than the one of the losers. But since paradigms usually come with their own criteria for establishing what progress actually amounts to, and how progress can be measured, it's hard to determine from a neutral perspective whether progress has indeed been made. As is well known, at the end of the day, Kuhn resorted to very general criteria. Like simplicity, consistency, explanatory scope, puzzle-solving capacity, and also, for example, predictive power, as ways to find out whether actually progress has been made in the case of a paradigm shift, especially, of course, when two paradigms continue to live just juxtaposed to each other. But given the underdetermination of theories and paradigms by the data, these very general criteria usually do not point unambivalently in one and only one direction. Moreover, according to Kuhn, these criteria, especially the one of puzzle-solving capacity, signal practical progress rather than epistemic progress. So they just show that we can handle more problems. They don't show that we have an increased amount of knowledge or understanding of reality. So it's not so evident that the sciences succeed in making trans-paradigmatic progress. But even despite this, one might be inclined to think that trans-paradigmatic progress is possible in the sciences and is also possible and even actual in theology. Think, for example, of the many religions that once flourished, but now have become extinct because of the fact that its theologians did no longer succeed in making sense of life in light of that religion's basic assumptions. For example, the worship of deities like Wodan and Zeus has vanished, most probably because its adherents did no longer succeed in making sense of life in terms of these religions because of the shift, for example, from an agricultural to a more urban society. In this way, it might be argued that theology does make epistemic progress, which can also be recognized as such outside its own paradigm. Of course, there are still many coexisting theological paradigms left. Even now, we don't have many worshippers of Zeus anymore. We still have many coexisting theological paradigms left, more than in the sciences, much more than in the sciences, which is probably due to the generality of the questions that are being addressed by theologies. But theologians have entered from various traditions. Theologians from various traditions have entered into ever more sophisticated forms of addressing this wide religious diversity, in trying to just think it through and trying to come up with answers to the question how this can be explained. For example, in the development of well thought through theologies of religion, as they are being called. So theologies which focus on the question why there are so many religions and how they relate to each other. But also, and much more recently, in the development of what has been called comparative theology, which is really a paradigm transcending branch of the discipline of theology. So even though such developments do not result in quick fits or easy answers, perhaps the fact that they take place is already a sign of theology's capacity to make progress beyond the boundaries of a single religious paradigm. Now, let me... Oh, I thought I had a concluding slide. Yeah, here's the concluding slide. So let me end with a conclusion. I have tried to explore 5 different answers to the question whether theology is making progress. Of course, we may ask some questions about these answers, and I'm happy to invite you to do so, and I'm looking forward to the sort of questions which you may be going to ask. I mean, this is the first time I deliver this paper, so I'm very curious indeed. One of the questions that might be asked is whether these 5 options are exhaustive, or whether other ones could be and should be added. And another question which would be interesting to investigate is to what extent the answers are compatible. I would think that most of the answers are compatible with each other. And even when, as the first answer has it, theology remains critical to progress as an overall cultural and economic ideal, it may show modest signs of epistemic progress in the sense of each of the other answers. So if that's true, perhaps we don't need to resort to experiments like those of Brother Juniper to bolster theology's credibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gijsbert, for this beautifully clear and learned talk of yours. You obviously gave the topic a great deal of interesting thought. So we now have about 30 minutes available for Q&A. There are 2 ways you can participate. You can either, in the Zoom, indicate that you have a question. If you do have a question, then that will mean that you will have to present the question from your screen, or if you're present here, you can articulate the question yourself. For instance, you could do that by, in the Zoom, raising your hand or indicating, yes, I have a question. The other way is to actually type out your question in the Zoom. It'll be forwarded to me, and I'll read it out loud to Gijsbert, and then he can answer. So there are already a couple of questions. Are you ready, Gijsbert?
Yeah. I am.
There's a question about